Today, we're pulling apart the full record of the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry, specifically how a single regiment fought 3 completely different wars at the same time, why a hand-drawn map produced under extreme battlefield pressure may have changed the outcome of a decisive Civil War engagement, and what it actually looked like when the war ended not with a parade, but with a long, dusty march into Texas. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this record, and I want to start right at the beginning. Where does this regiment even come from?
So the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry was organized at Camp Washburn in Milwaukee between December 30th, 1861 and March 10th, 1862. Initial strength was 1,127 officers and men, and the commanding officer was Colonel Cadwallader C. Washburn, who was later promoted to Brigadier General. And what's immediately striking about this regiment is that it was never really one unit in the field. It was 3 battalions that almost immediately went their separate ways.
Right, and that separation is kind of the key to understanding everything that follows, isn't it?
Completely. So by the spring and summer of 1862, the regiment underwent what the records call battalion separation. The majority of the 1st Battalion, Companies A, D, G, and K, were assigned to field duty in Missouri. Meanwhile, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions were sent first to Springfield, Missouri, then to Curtis's army at Augusta, Arkansas, and later to Helena. So from very early on, you have men from the same regiment living fundamentally different wars.
That's a really unusual situation. Most people think of a regiment as this unified thing that moves together.
And that assumption breaks down almost immediately with the 2nd Wisconsin. The 1st Battalion ends up in a guerrilla shadow war in Missouri. Patrols, picket lines, chasing bushwhackers through wooded river valleys. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions end up in the grand operational campaigns of the Western Theater, eventually under Sherman himself. Same regiment, completely different experiences.
So let's stay with the 1st Battalion for a moment, because there's a figure in that battalion who I think is genuinely fascinating, Lieutenant Napoleon Boardman.
Yeah, Boardman is one of those figures who doesn't appear in the standard regimental histories, but keeps showing up in the margins of really significant events. He's documented as a junior officer and cartographer within the 1st Battalion, and that cartographic skill is what makes him historically interesting.
And the 1st Battalion is the only part of the regiment present at Prairie Grove, right? Which is where Boardman's map comes in.
Exactly. So the Battle of Prairie Grove, fought on December 7th, 1862, was the decisive engagement that ended major Confederate operations in northwest Arkansas. And it's one of those battles that is genuinely consequential, but almost nobody outside of Civil War specialists knows about it.
Walk me through what actually happened there, because the setup is remarkable.
So the Confederate commander, Major General Thomas Hindman, had assembled a force of roughly 11,000 to 12,000 men. His strategic intent was clear. He wanted to destroy Union General Francis Herron's division before it could unite with Brigadier General James Blunt, who commanded another Union force at Cane Hill. Hindman believed that defeating Herron in isolation would allow him to reclaim northwest Arkansas and threaten Missouri.
And Herron's response to this threat is just extraordinary.
It really is. Herron commanded about 7,000 to 8,000 men, and when Blunt discovered Hindman's army moving north, he urgently called for reinforcement. Herron responded with what the records describe as one of the most remarkable forced marches of the war, covering over 110 miles in 3 days through cold, muddy Ozark roads.
110 miles in 3 days, through the Ozarks, in December.
And here's the critical detail. Herron's forces arrived without maps. They had just marched rapidly from Missouri into Arkansas and had no cartography on which to plan a battle. The terrain at Prairie Grove was complex. Ridges, orchards, fields, and the Prairie Grove Church Ridge. Herron needed accurate, quickly produced maps to coordinate artillery and infantry movements.
And that's where Boardman comes in.
He is credited in contemporary accounts and later historical commentary with producing a hand-drawn tactical map of the Prairie Grove battlefield. The map appears in archives and is referenced in Civil War cartographic collections as an example of field-expedient Union mapping. Now, I should be precise here, Boardman's name is not in the standard regimental histories. The attribution comes from secondary historical commentary and battlefield scholarship, and it's an inference based on the regiment's documented assignments and the known provenance of the map.
So it's historically grounded, but not airtight.
Correct. And I think that's actually part of what makes it interesting. It's the kind of attribution that reflects how much of the war's operational detail was never formally recorded. The map exists. The regiment was there, Boardman was the battalion's documented cartographer. The inference is reasonable, but it's an inference.
Right. So, how did the battle itself unfold? Because the tactical situation sounds genuinely complicated.
It unfolded in three major phases. In the first phase, Herron deployed his artillery aggressively, initiating a fierce duel across the valley. He ordered 2 brigades to cross the valley and assault the ridge. The Union troops advanced under heavy fire, reached the crest, and briefly broke through, but Hindman counterattacked with fresh infantry and drove them back. This phase produced some of the day's heaviest casualties.
And then Blunt arrives.
Around mid-afternoon, Blunt's division, marching hard from Cane Hill, unexpectedly arrived on the Union left. Hindman had not anticipated Blunt's appearance and suddenly found his line threatened on 2 fronts. The Union line now stretched nearly a mile, and the battle became a massive, swirling engagement of infantry volleys, artillery fire, and counterattacks.
So Hindman's whole plan, destroy Herron before Blunt arrives, just collapses.
It collapses, and by dusk, both armies held their ground, but Hindman's ammunition was nearly exhausted, and his supply situation was untenable. During the night, he ordered a withdrawal south toward Van Buren. The next morning, the Union Army found the ridge abandoned. Prairie Grove was a tactical stalemate but a strategic Union victory. Hindman's army was forced to retreat, and the Union secured northwest Arkansas permanently.
The casualties were pretty equal, weren't they? Which tells you something about how fierce the fighting was.
Nearly equal. Union casualties were approximately 1,251, Confederate approximately 1,317. The numbers reflect the ferocity of the fighting and the balanced nature of the engagement. And units like the 20 Wisconsin Infantry, the 19th Iowa, and the 26th Indiana distinguished themselves in Herron's initial assault, suffering severe losses but achieving that temporary breakthrough on the ridge that was one of the most dramatic moments of the battle.
And the 1st Battalion's cavalry role in all of this, it wasn't just the map.
No, the cavalry conducted critical reconnaissance that allowed Herron to understand Hindman's position. They were also ordered into battle at pressure points and to harry Hindman's flanks. So Boardman and his men were doing the work that made the rest of the battle possible. The intelligence gathering, the terrain assessment, the flank harassment. It's the kind of contribution that doesn't show up in the dramatic accounts, but is absolutely foundational.
Okay, so that's the 1st Battalion's war in late 1862. Meanwhile, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions are on a completely different trajectory.
Completely different. By January 1863, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions had arrived in Memphis, Tennessee, which had fallen to Union forces in 1862 and become a major logistical hub for operations aimed at Vicksburg. Their duties included patrol, escort, reconnaissance, and the protection of supply lines, tasks essential to maintaining the flow of men and material toward the Mississippi's most formidable Confederate stronghold.
And then they get absorbed into Sherman's command.
Gradually. By April 1863, the battalions were transferred to Snyder's Bluff, a fortified position north of Vicksburg on the Yazoo River, Sherman's forward operating base during the early phases of the campaign. The Wisconsin troopers were now directly under Sherman's umbrella, performing reconnaissance, courier service, and picket duty along the Yazoo.
Snyder's Bluff sounds like a tense posting.
Very tense. Confederate forces under Pemberton watched Union movements closely, and skirmishes were frequent. The Wisconsin cavalrymen were often the first to encounter Confederate patrols probing the riverbanks and the swampy approaches to Vicksburg. Sherman relied heavily on cavalry intelligence, and the 2nd Wisconsin's battalions became part of the information network that allowed him to coordinate with Grant, McPherson, and McClernand as the army maneuvered around Vicksburg's defenses.
And then Vicksburg falls on July 4th, 1863, after 47 days of siege. That's one of the most decisive moments of the entire war.
It is. Pemberton surrendered, the Mississippi River became a Union highway, and the Confederacy was split in two. But Grant's work wasn't finished. Confederate forces under General Joseph Johnston were gathering to the east at Jackson, threatening to challenge Grant's army. Grant turned immediately to confront them.
And the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry Battalions move with Sherman's columns into that Jackson campaign.
They do. Their role intensified during the Jackson campaign, scouting ahead of Sherman's infantry divisions, screening the flanks from Confederate cavalry under W.H. Jackson, disrupting Confederate communications and rail lines, and providing rapid response to Johnston's attempts to probe Sherman's movements. When Johnston evacuated Jackson on July 16th, Sherman ordered the destruction of railroads, factories, and military facilities, and the cavalry battalions helped enforce the occupation.
So by the end of the summer of 1863, these battalions are fully integrated into Sherman's command structure. That's a significant transformation from where they started.
It's a profound transformation. The records note that the transfer into Sherman's army exposed them to large-scale operations far beyond the Missouri borderlands, placed them under one of the most dynamic commanders of the war, and prepared them for the long raids and expeditions they would undertake in 1864. Sherman's army was a crucible of movement, coordination, and relentless pressure, and the 2nd Wisconsin's battalions proved themselves capable, reliable, and adaptable, qualities Sherman valued highly.
Which brings us to 1864, and what I think is the most operationally fascinating chapter of the regiment's service, the 300-mile raid, or the Long Raid, or the Mississippi Raid, or the Gaines Landing Expedition.
Right, and the naming confusion is itself historically revealing. Contemporaries never settled on a single fixed name for this operation because it didn't fit neatly into the patterns that usually produced famous Civil War raid nomenclature. It wasn't led by a nationally prominent cavalry commander, it didn't revolve around one dramatic battle, and it unfolded across a wide, shifting geography rather than a single identifiable corridor.
So officers and veterans just described it in functional terms, whatever aspect of it they were remembering.
Exactly. The records show terms like the Long Raid, the 300-mile raid, the Mississippi Raid, or the Gaines Landing Expedition, each phrase capturing a different aspect of the same operation. The nomenclature confusion is a window into the nature of the raid itself, fluid, wide-ranging, and remembered more for its hardship and impact than for any formal title.
What were the actual objectives? Why was this raid ordered?
By mid-1864, Confederate forces in Mississippi were fragmented but still dangerous. Small detachments of cavalry and irregulars were harassing Union supply lines, threatening isolated garrisons, and attempting to reestablish communication between Arkansas, Louisiana, and the remaining Confederate strongholds east of the Mississippi. Union commanders needed a mobile force to strike deep into enemy territory, destroying infrastructure, scattering Confederate detachments, and denying the South any hope of reorganizing in the region.
And the 2nd Wisconsin, hardened by 2 years of service, was chosen for the task.
The regiment set out from Vicksburg, moving north and east into the tangled interior of Mississippi. The roads were poor, the heat oppressive, and the countryside alternately swampy and dusty. They encountered resistance almost immediately. Confederate cavalry under various local commanders shadowed the column, striking at pickets, firing from tree lines, and attempting to lure Union detachments into ambushes.
And the destruction they carried out, this wasn't random. It was systematic.
Very deliberate. The regiment destroyed railroad tracks by heating and twisting the rails into what were called Sherman's neckties. Rail depots were burned. Bridges were dropped into rivers and bayous. Cotton stores, which the Confederacy relied on for trade and financing, were burned. Military warehouses containing ammunition, uniforms, and food were looted for everything useful, then burned. Each act of destruction was aimed at the systematic dismantling of Confederate logistics.
And the human cost on the Union side, the horses, the men, it sounds brutal.
The horses suffered terribly. Many went lame, others collapsed from exhaustion. The men fared little better, sleeping in short snatches, eating whatever rations they could carry, riding through rainstorms, mud, and blistering heat. The raid was punctuated by dozens of small engagements, sharp, violent encounters that rarely lasted more than a few minutes but kept the regiment in a constant state of readiness.
And then there's the Gaines Landing phase, where they cross into Arkansas.
One of the raid's most dramatic phases. The regiment crossed into Arkansas, striking Confederate positions near Gaines Landing on the Mississippi River, where they encountered more organized resistance, Confederate forces attempting to defend river crossings and supply depots. The regiment fought its way through, capturing stores, scattering defenders, and continuing its destructive sweep along the river corridor. The crossing into Arkansas symbolized the raid's reach. The 2nd Wisconsin was not merely patrolling, it was reshaping the strategic landscape of two states.
And when it was all over, they had covered over 300 miles, destroyed critical Confederate infrastructure, and fought numerous engagements without suffering catastrophic losses.
The strategic impact was far greater than the number of skirmishes fought or bridges burned. The raid contributed directly to the collapse of Confederate mobility in the region, the isolation of remaining Confederate garrisons, and the protection of Union supply lines feeding Sherman's armies. It was one of the defining episodes of the regiment's service, a demonstration of endurance, discipline, and effectiveness in the harshest conditions of the war.
And then 1865 arrives, and the regiment's final chapter is genuinely unexpected.
It is unexpected. As 1864 wound down, the regiment was transferred to the Department of the Gulf, a vast administrative command responsible for Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. When news of Lee's surrender reached the Western armies, the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry was stationed in Alexandria, Louisiana, performing occupation and stabilization duties along the Red River.
So for them, the war didn't end at Appomattox.
Not at all. Texas was the final Confederate state to surrender, and in early summer 1865, the Union Army began its occupation. The 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry marched westward from Louisiana into Hempstead, Texas, a small town that became a major concentration point for Union forces entering the state. The march itself was arduous, oppressive heat, dusty and poorly maintained roads, and long stretches of unsettled land. Many troopers later recalled that the march into Texas felt more like a frontier expedition than a military campaign.
And what were they actually doing in Texas? What did occupation duty look like?
From Hempstead, the regiment moved to Austin, the state capital. Their duties included guarding government buildings and supply depots, patrolling roads to deter banditry and guerrilla remnants, enforcing the terms of surrender among former Confederate units, supporting the Freedmen's Bureau in its earliest efforts, and maintaining order during the political transition from Confederate to federal authority. Austin in 1865 was a tense city. The war had ended, but its consequences were only beginning.
And the mustering out happened in stages.
In stages. On July 3, 1865, about 1/5 of the regiment, those whose enlistments expired earliest, were mustered out at Memphis. On November 15, 1865, the remainder were mustered out at Austin. And finally, on December 14, 1865, the regiment formally disbanded at Madison, Wisconsin, returning home after nearly 4 years of service.
There's something almost poignant about that. They enlisted to fight battles in Missouri, Arkansas, and Mississippi, and their final months were spent as peacekeepers in a distant frontier state.
And yet their presence mattered enormously. The 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry helped ensure that the war ended cleanly, that Confederate resistance did not rekindle, and that the transition to Reconstruction began under stable conditions. The Department of the Gulf and Texas occupation rarely appear in popular Civil War histories, yet they were essential to the Union's victory. The regiment's role in this phase demonstrated an adaptability that defined their entire service.
I want to come back to Boardman for a moment, because his personal story is a thread that runs through all of this, and it ends in a way that feels very human.
Boardman's story is a good lens for understanding what the 1st Battalion's war actually felt like. While the 2nd and 3rd Battalions were thundering through Mississippi and Louisiana, Boardman and the 1st Battalion were living a very different war. Patrols, picket lines, river crossings, and endless vigilance in Missouri. A war where danger was constant but rarely spectacular, and where the enemy was more often a guerrilla band than a formal Confederate brigade.
And when Lee surrendered, the news reached them by courier.
First as rumor, then as official confirmation. Officers read the dispatch aloud to their companies, and the records note that the reaction was not jubilation so much as a long exhale. For men who had spent years chasing guerrillas through Missouri's backcountry, the end of the war meant the end of uncertainty. It meant that the scattered resistance they faced would finally lose its purpose.
A long exhale. That's a remarkable way to describe it.
And the battalion continued patrolling for weeks afterward, ensuring that bushwhacker bands disbanded, that parole terms were respected, and that the fragile peace held. Only when the Department of the Missouri declared the region secure did the battalion receive orders to stand down.
And Boardman goes home to Fond du Lac.
He goes home to Fond du Lac, where his wife and young son waited. His son, Charles Ruggles Boardman, had been born during the war and was now 4 years old enough to recognize the man who stepped through the door, but young enough that the reunion carried a sense of wonder. Boardman returned not as the young officer who had left in 1861, but as a seasoned veteran who had mapped battlefields, ridden through hostile country, and spent years in service far from home.
And there's a remarkable historical echo in that homecoming, because Charles Ruggles Boardman would go on to found Wisconsin's 32nd Red Arrow Division of World War I fame.
Which means the cartographic legacy of a Civil War cavalry officer, a man who drew a hand-drawn tactical map under battlefield pressure in the Arkansas Ozarks, echoed forward into the next great conflict through his son. That's the kind of historical thread that doesn't appear in the standard accounts, but is genuinely significant when you trace it. The 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry was never the headline unit. They weren't at Gettysburg, they didn't have a famous commander whose name everyone knows, but they were present at every critical juncture in the Trans-Mississippi and Western campaigns: Prairie Grove, Vicksburg, Jackson, the Long Raid, the Texas occupation. They were the connective tissue of the Union war effort in that theater.
And the three-war structure of their service, the 1st Battalion's guerrilla war in Missouri, the 2nd and 3rd Battalion's grand operational campaigns, that's not just an organizational curiosity. It reflects the actual complexity of the Civil War in the West.
Exactly. The Civil War in the Western Theater was not one war, it was multiple overlapping conflicts happening simultaneously. Border state guerrilla warfare, massive riverine campaigns, long cavalry raids, and then the strange, quiet work of occupation and reconstruction. The 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry experienced all of it, which makes their record unusually comprehensive as a window into what that war actually was.
And the Boardman story humanizes all of that in a way that pure operational history can't.
Boardman's return to Fond du Lac, lifting his 4-year-old son into his arms and beginning the slow work of rebuilding a life interrupted by 4 years of conflict, that's the ending of the regiment's story that the official records don't capture.